We're going to be having on November 17th and 18th, we're going to do the L8 welcome party.
Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. And I'm so excited to be able to be here and share what I love more than anything really is serging and all the decorative ways that you can use an L8 series serger. But what I want to do is first introduce myself. I'm Pam Massey and I'm the Overlock business manager for BERNINA. And I love, as I said, the creative side. I'm just really excited that Jennifer asked me to come and spend some time with all of you and be able to share these new L8 machines. They're in the store with you. All right, so the introduction of the L8 machines that we have, and actually I forgot to add the newest one, which I have sitting right there behind me, which is the L860 machine. The L850 and the L860 were introduced last year and to great success. People and those customers that have the machines and those that are looking at the machines have just truly been blown away with how great they are, how easy they are to use. And part of the reason we say they've been blown away is because they have air threading. So that air threading just really lifts it to a whole new level and makes it so much easier to use a serger. And then also there you can see that there's a screen that's on the machine. And I'm going to share with you some ways that that screen is going to make serging even easier for you. These machines have the capability of stitching cover stitch as well as chain stitch and an overlock stitch. So this gives us an idea when you look at the first picture that we have here, a picture of the wide cover stitch. Now this wide cover stitch you can use with the needle side facing up, and it looks just like twin needle work that you would have on your sewing machine. But then if you use the reverse side of it and you use some decorative thread, this is where the creative side comes in. And you can really use this stitch for some creative work, and we'll look at more samples in a little bit. But now not only do we have the wide cover stitch, but you also have a narrow cover stitch that you can also use. And this narrow cover stitch allows you to put the needles closer together and again, use what looks like a twin needle closer together, and then the cover stitch decorative side with decorative thread. Then the last stitch that we've looked at is the chain stitch. Now the chain stitch is something that you can use again, not only for decorative work, but you can also use this as a straight stitch, just like you do on your sewing machine. Now here, this stitch is going to look much, much heavier because I used a very heavy thread. But a lot of times what quilters like to do is stitch very, very quickly. So our machines can sew up to 1,350 stitches a minute when you're stitching with the chain stitch. On the overlock, you can sew up to 1,500 stitches per minute. And when you're piecing together, here you can piece together very, very quickly. And also, if you are a garment sewist or your seam doesn't always look exactly the way you want it, it is a chain stitch, so you can pull that stitch out pretty easily. But if you're wanting it to be secured, you secure the seam and it's going to be locked in place and it's not going to come out or not going to come apart. Now, I would consider myself a non-traditional quilter. I probably don't follow, I've never really taken a quilting class. So some of the things that I'm probably going to share with you today, you might go, oh, I don't know if I would ever try that. Just keep in mind that there isn't always one way to do anything, right? And sometimes it's good for us to step out of our box a little bit and try something new. So this is where using the chain stitch, I like to use for piecing. And I find that when I piece with my overlock machine or my chain stitch, my feed dogs are twice as long as they are on my sewing machine. So I feel I have more control of my fabric when I'm going to be stitching and I'm going to be seaming pieces together, especially long strips of fabric. So now let's take a look at what are called combo stitches. Now these combo stitches will combine both an overlock, as you can see on the edge of those fabric strips, and also the chain stitch. And you notice that those chain stitches are spaced a different increment from the edge of our fabric. Because there are different needle positions that you have in the machine, you can simply move the needle to a different position, and that gives you a different seam allowance width. So that gives you either a 3/8, ½ inch, or a full 5/8 inch seam allowance when you're using that combo stitch and it's using the chain and cover stitch, chain and overlock stitch together. So that's where the combo look comes from, or definition comes from. This is mainly used in garments, garment industry use that you'll see on many ready-to-wear garments. Now let's take a look at some of the stitches that you might be more familiar with in the overlock side. And we're going to start with a 2-thread flatlock stitch. This stitch is really a lot of fun, and it can be very functional as well. Because when you're working with a 2-thread stitch, this 2-thread stitch allows the fabric pieces to lay completely flat. Now, I'm sure some of you have a stash of fabrics there in your sewing area, and you're always looking for ways to put them all back together and then make something new, right? So this is a great way to join those pieces of fabric back together and then make something new with it. Any size, any shape, just like you do crazy quilting on your sewing machine. Here we're going to be using and placing the right side of our fabric together. And when you stitch using a decorative thread in your needle and you pull it apart, it gives you, can you see the little ladders that are on that sample? It gives you that look of little ladder rungs that in a minute, I'll show you something else that you can do with that. So now when we take this 2-thread flatlock stitch and apply it to quilting, here we've taken and actually joined together all the strips of fabric that you can see for the blocks. Then I use the same stitch that I did in that previous pillow picture. So it's little rungs, and we're going to take a closer look at it. Then I pieced together the columns. So then I had 4 different columns of these blocks that were all pieced together. And there I put wrong sides together. So when I pulled the stitch apart, now I have a little squiggly stitch on top, a serpentine stitch. So it's the other side of the stitch. Then I did the pieces or quilt-as-you-go method, and I joined each one of those columns together using a 9mm wide stitch that we have on the machine. So now I can take a bigger bite into both pieces of fabric, and I had 2 layers of batting, 2 layers of top fabric, and 2 layers of bottom fabric that I could join all together at the same time. Yet, after I had it stitched and opened up that stitch, it lays completely flat. There are no seam allowances. So let's take a closer look at how that actually looks. So here, when you look at the strips that were pieced together, you can see that and I took the 45-inch or the length of the strip of fabric, all of those different fabrics, and I just stripped them together and then cut them apart and then put them back together just like you would normally do. And there you could either use a 1/4-inch seam allowance and not have a decorative stitch, or you could use a chain stitch to piece it together too. But then, as I mentioned, when I took those columns and I pieced them together, I used a 9mm wide stitch. So then to add, again, a little more interest and a little more creative opportunity there, I took a 3/8 inch wide ribbon and ran the ribbon through those little rungs of the needle thread. So now it gives a different look and, again, a little more decorative application. And everyone asks, how in the world did you sew that pattern and put that ribbon on at the same time? Well, you do it separate. You sew the line of stitching and then you weave that ribbon through. I also put my binding on. And when I use my 2-thread Flatlock, and I'm going to hold these up so you can see it, but when I use my batting pieces, and no matter if we're long arm quilters or we're going to be taking a piece of batting, it's generally not exactly the size that we need it, or we have extra pieces left over. So what I do is I'll take my batting and I'll sew them back together using that 2-thread Flatlock stitch. And there you can see the stitch is completely flat with those batting pieces. And by using, again, you have differential feed on your serger, you're eliminating that waffly look that you would get, or having to go back and press your batting so the seam lays flat when you would use it in another project. So that's another way that you can use functionally a 2-thread Flatlock. But then, as I mentioned, I did apply my binding with a 4-thread stitch. We'll look at that when we get to the 4-thread. And then I did top stitch it using my chain stitch. So this entire quilt was done using the 890 serger. So let's take a look then at some other 2-thread applications. So we've looked at how that 2-thread Flatlock stitch opens up and lays flat, but here we've actually taken that 2-thread Flatlock stitch, we've stitched it in place, and then flipped it over, and from the wrong side, stitched a chain stitch right next to it. So it looks like a trim rather than just a Flatlock stitch. So you can combine these stitches together. And again, when you use multicolored or variegated thread, you get another level of look to your project. So another way is to insert a zipper. So if you take and you're wanting to put a zipper in, you can use a piping foot, and you can use a 2-thread Flatlock stitch, and you stitch it with, again, wrong sides together. And after you stitch it and wiggle the stitch apart, you get this beautiful trim that's right along the edge of each side of your zipper. Now this I always call, this is like a 2-thread explosion, 2-thread stitching explosion. So Gail Yellen, who we are starting to work with, she does some amazing serger work as well. And she did a blog post on We All Sew and did the 2-thread application in one area of a placemat. I think it was kind of a collection that she had put together. And here she's using various widths of the 2-thread Flatlock, and then various widths of ribbon, and then weaving them in different patterns. So again, it looks completely different than a basic 2-thread overlock stitch would be. And again, showing the needle side of that stitch. Now, another 2-thread stitch, this is a fringe that we've actually created using a 2-thread wrap stitch on the machines. And this can be done on any of the overlock machines. But with a 2-thread wrap stitch, you're going to be stitching it on the edge of your fabric. And then with your sewing machine, you can zigzag or do a decorative stitch right on top of the loops that you formed. And then from the back side, you clip your needle thread. And that gives you the fringe. It opens up and it lays completely flat. So here's a place that we used that fringe, and it just gives a lot of depth and dimension where sometimes overlock stitching can sometimes be a little bit flat on your fabrics or projects. Here, you're able to see that it can be loose. It can be off the edge of your fabrics. And again, combining both cover stitch, chain stitch, and overlock stitching. And this whole bag, again, was made using the serger. No sewing machine stitching was done. And there we used the soft and stable for the structure of the bag, and did all of the quilting stitching on the bag itself, the front side and back side of the bag, using the chain stitch. Because you have such a large space, you can see that right here. We're going to come in closer on this, but there's a really large space that's on the machine, and that allows you to sew on the interior of your fabrics, even when you have a larger piece of fabric. And because when we were looking at the quilt and we were doing the 2-thread flatlock stitch, we talked about how we had so many layers of fabric. Your cutting blade comes up higher, and because you have a 9mm wide stitch, you can accommodate those thicker fabrics as well. So next, we're going to move into a 3-thread overlock stitch. Now, as I just mentioned, that overlock stitching can be stitched up to 9mm wide. And when you place decorative threads into your loopers with an overlock, you're going to be able to really create a lot of texture and a lot of dimension again with that 9mm wide stitch. When you take a look at this sample, you'll notice that the gold stitching is that 9mm wide stitching. And the red stitching is only 7.5mm, which is the widest that many other sergers will actually stitch at. And you don't have to balance out the other stitches when you're using the same thread in both the upper and the lower looper. Automatically balances it out. Now, I love to show these because for a couple of reasons. When I look at this, the area that is woven, it actually, to me, looks like ribbons that are added to the outside edge of those fabric strips. And all it is a 12-weight thread that was placed in the upper and lower looper and stitched on long strips of fabric, just like you saw on that little basket that was done. But because the 12-weight thread is thinner, it's going to lay flatter. And again, that 9mm wide stitch. I can't emphasize that enough because I just love how many applications there are for that. So there is also a pattern for this placemat, and I have another version of it hanging over there on the wall. But there are different patterns that we have just created to show the many different uses of using your serger in a decorative way. Now, when we're working with like those placemats that we just did, part of working with your serger is wanting to know how to turn nice, neat, even corners. And when you're doing this, you're able to pivot your presser foot out of the way. So it makes it so much easier to actually see that you're coming right to the very edge. And another part of it is that I mentioned earlier that it sews up to 1,300 and 1,500 stitches a minute. And so many times we think about serging as always being fast. But with the BERNINA sergers now, you have speed as well as precision because you have that BERNINA foot control, and you can simply tap on the back of the foot control and you can move one stitch at a time, which is absolutely fabulous when you're wanting to come right to the corner or one stitch off the edge, because most of the time you're stitching fast. It's kind of like driving with your husband sometimes, right? You know, he comes up to the stop sign and it's like 40 miles an hour, stop, right? But sometimes it's like when you're driving, you don't always get to that stop sign right when you want to. So here, when we use the needle up and down, you can move quickly up to a certain point, and then you can simply tap your foot pedal up and down with the needle to get just to that point and not zoom right through the stop sign. Okay, so now when we are looking at this sample, when you turn a corner, the fabric or the thread is going to be thicker. So when the presser foot comes up over to start stitching, how do you keep your fabric so that it's not kind of balling up right at the beginning when you start the next corner? So here's a suggestion. What I'd like you to do is take, because we generally test our stitches first, take that test strip of fabric, and when you're starting to stitch, rest it behind your presser foot, which evens out your foot and it's not having to climb up over the heel in order to start stitching the next corner when you come around to that edge. Okay, so that's a little tip there. And this is also a pattern that helps you learn more about your machine, but you end up with a really nice project in the end. And this again is a project from Gail Yellen and the Table Runner project. 2-thread flatlock stitching is used, rolled hems are used, the wide 3-thread overlock is also used, and a 4-thread to stitch it all together. But when we work with that 9mm wide stitch, we noticed and let me back up real quick here. So when you look at this stitch, you see how, and here I am pointing at my screen. You can't see me pointing my finger at my screen, but you see how the gold and the green threads line up right on the very edge of your fabric. Okay, that's typically how it's going to work. But what we can do through what's called total stitch control, as well as having that 9mm wide stitch, we can create our own stitches. So now here, we've again taken that 9mm wide stitch and we placed black thread in the upper looper, pink thread in the lower looper, and then we played with the balance of that stitch. And instead of it balancing right on the edge of our fabric, we now have it balancing on the top in the middle of our fabric. So now you have 2 colors of stitching on the edge of your fabric, all done at exactly the same time. So it's just a very fun way of adjusting your stitches. And you might say, well, how am I ever going to remember what that setting is going to be? Well, what you can do is you can now save these settings into the memory. Remember, we've got the screen there. We can save these settings into our machine. So now when I want to do this stitch again, or I have another stitch that I have changed settings to my personal liking, I can save it and it's there each and every time. I can label it up to 40 different characters within that memory, and it's always going to be there until I decide to get rid of it. And I don't have to worry about where did I write these instructions down? I can't find the piece of paper. And what did I mean when I actually wrote that down? Okay, it's all going to be there for you. All right, so now, just as we mentioned, this kind of takes a different look at that stitch. And you can see with the white thread being the upper looper and the black thread being the lower looper, you get that balance of your stitch in a different place. Now, this is also a 3-thread stitch, and this fringe or ruffle was actually created with just thread. And it's using the 3-thread overlock stitch and linking one row into the next row. And as much as I know about physics, the bigger the circle, the more ruffly it's going to get because of the size of the circle becoming larger. So I love to do this. And again, by having that needle up and needle down ability, it gives me much more precision when I'm doing decorative work like this. And this little bonnet was done exactly the same way, just with stitching completely flat. And one row, you can see how the rows are kind of linked into each other. And to create the ruffle, we simply shortened our stitch length and stitched around the outside of that bonnet to create the ruffled edge. This tote bag here was developed by an Australian designer, Kate Mara. And there, she's actually taken the technique of stitching one loop into the next, so it's completely flat stitching. And then we applied, it's called Cote, and place that on top of the stitching to make it very hard and firm like fabric. So then we could place it into this tote bag just as we would another piece of fabric. And the little chains that are on there are just tails from the chain stitch or the rolled hem stitch. And as that glue was drying, we just laid those on top and pressed them in and put another layer of that oughta coat on top just to hold those layers all together. But I did this bag almost 2 years ago now, and everybody's been touching it, handling it, and it's just fine. Oh, and you see the red piping that's on there? That's also made with the piping foot on the serger. And once you start doing piping with your serger, you'll never want to do piping any other way, because you can use any width of fabric and place it over your cotton cord. And when you stitch, it's going to cut it exactly, the seam allowance, exactly the width that you need to reinsert it back into your project again. Love it. Okay, let's move into rolled hem and chain stitching. So typically rolled hems are what we see and use on the edges of napkins or any place that your pattern would say to do a narrow double turn hem. But here, Gail has again taken that chain, blending the threads together. So putting one color of thread in your upper looper, another color of thread in your lower looper, and just simply stitching long lengths of chain, pressing it flat and using it as trim on these little Christmas balls. And those little Christmas balls, any sewer would love to receive and hang on their tree, because they're so unusual and very decorative. And you can also, this is a great way to maybe use up some of those little ends of spools of thread. Because again, if you're like me, you throw nothing away until it's absolutely gone. And then you're looking for a way to use that empty spool. What can I use this for, right? So this is a great way. Chain off some of the chain when you get close to the end of the spool, and you can use it for trims. You can also use a cording foot to stitch over fish line. And just as you see on these little flowers, the edges of these flowers are very supported and very structured. And that is done with wire, or it's also done with the fish line. And if you take anything out of your husband's tackle box, make sure you put it back so you're not getting yourself in trouble. But I like to use anywhere between an 8 and 30-pound test fish line, depending upon the weight of the fabric that I'm going to be working with. And also, one thing I wanted to point out, when you look at these leaves on this little floral arrangement, those also have a rolled hem. But sometimes when it's getting to that time of the year now where we're probably going to be stitching up some blankets to give and throws that we just want to cuddle up with on the couch. And what I like to do is, instead of cutting an edge, cutting a curve, I'll draw the curve with a marker and I'll let my machine cut it for me. Because now as I'm coming around that edge, the machine will cut and it will always sew right at the same line that it's cutting at. But if you cut first, you're trying to stay on the edge, and it doesn't always stay as close to the edge as you want it to. So let your machine do the work for you, and it'll cut it and give you a much nicer edge, whether it's a rolled hem or it's a 3-thread or 2-thread flatlock, overlock stitch. Now this is, again, taking it to the next level. So we've had some time now to play with our machines, and this is still a rolled hem. But what we've done is we've actually taken the stitch finger, and on the front of your machine, you'll have the rolled hem position and you have an overlock position. So what we did is we counted some stitches, or you can, if you're musical and you have a metronome at your house, you can set the metronome and you can set your foot control, your speed to a slower speed. And you're just sliding that stitch finger in and out to create that scalloped edge on the edge of your fabric. So I haven't, this is just a sample that we've done. I haven't had much time to do anything with it, but I can't wait to do something more with it. And again, the picture on the left, the green, Gail had actually taken the scallop and laid a zipper behind it, and then used a cover stitch and stitched on top with the same color thread. So then all you see is that little picoed edge peeking out from behind the cover stitch that's there. So really, as you can see, sky's the limit when you start playing with your machine and the things that you can do. Making tassels, again, time of the year is coming up where we like to give gifts and to create tassels, add a little bit of sparkle using metallic, there we go, lost that word for just a minute, metallic thread, whether it's embroidery metallic thread or it's going to be a metallic thread that is a 12 weight thread. So either way, you can use 12 weight metallic thread in the loopers, or you can use a standard embroidery metallic thread too. Now you can use that with a chain stitch, and the chain stitch can be done with the chain needle on your machine. So when you stitch this, stitching out with the chain stitch rather than a rolled hem will give you a finer chain. The rolled hem being 3 threads will be a little bit thicker and a little bit heavier. So here we've taken that chain and we've simply taken a long length of knit fabric, and we used the rotary cutter that is intended to skip, not the one you have whacked into the side of your ruler a couple of times, and as you're trying to cut, it leaves a skip of fabric. But there are blades that are intended to actually leave openings or skips. So when we cut with this, we cut certain areas, and then we just took the chain and we wove it through those little openings, and it created this decorative look on the scarf. And then we used a rolled hem and just simply stretched the edge of the fabric, and that creates that lettuce edge that you see on the edge of that black scarf. So again, something simple yet decorative. Taking the chain, and this is stitched on, or not stitched, this is actually like a drawn thread work where we've drawn the thread out of the hem on the skirt, and then simply took the chain stitch and re-wove it back into the fabric itself in that pattern that we wanted. And it's kind of like kind of cross stitch using your serger, but doing the drawn thread work and using a heavily or loosely woven fabric. Here's a close-up look at using that skip blade, and you can see how it leaves an opening and how we've woven that chain. And by using beads and sliding those on as you're weaving, again, can create a whole nother look and dimension. The cover stitch, narrow cover stitch right next to it, we again played with our control of our thread, which pulled the bottom tighter, and it created a little raised area. So very much like a twin needle would on your sewing machine. Again, just using chain stitching as a decorative stitch. This is great when you're doing like crazy quilting, or if you're wanting to just stitch on top of a line of stitching and add a little bit of dimension. The green is showing the chain stitch by stitching the right side of your fabric facing down, and the yellow shows, or gold, shows the right side of your fabric facing up. And that's going to give you those two different looks. So now what can you do with the chain stitch? So a chain stitch, again, allows you to sew in the middle of your fabric. And when we stitched this bag, The ruffles were gathered using the chain stitch and the differential feed, because you can use differential feed on both sides of your machine, whether it's overlock or chain and cover stitching. Then the decorative lines of stitching on the right-hand side of the bag were used, again, with the right side of our fabric facing down, and just random lines of stitching that were using different decorative threads. Now on the back side, we're going to talk about blended threads first. So up until this point, we have been looking at one thread in one looper at a time. So now what we're going to look at is blending threads together. So you can take and place more than one thread in a looper at any one time. So the stitching on the left-hand side, the far left-hand side, is variegated thread. And you see how it creates that stripy effect. But the one in the middle, I took a solid green thread and blended it in the same looper with that variegated thread. So now it softens the variegation and it's not as stripy looking as what the one is on the left-hand side all by itself. So if you don't want any of that coloration or color change, what you can do is blend two solid colored threads in one looper at a time. And that's what the stitching shows you on the right-hand side of that group of three. So there we placed a green and a red thread in the same looper, blending them together so that, again, sometimes you see more green, sometimes you see more red, and it just, again, is the difference in the look that you want. But you can blend up to 5 embroidery threads if you wanted to in one looper. And it's going to feed through the machine as if it's one thread. And then sometimes the different colors are changing places as they go onto the fabric. Just as you can see with the chain stitch on the far right-hand side on that teal fabric, that's going to give you that blended coloration by using different solid colored threads all in one looper at a time. So looking at that same bag, the bag that we looked at earlier with all the ruffles on the front, this is the back of the bag. And here we've used the chain stitch and the narrow cover stitch to create our own fabric before we actually made the bag. So instead of always having to find a fabric that would match whatever you're wanting to use, you already have the fabric, you already have the thread, why not make your own? So this is another great way of incorporating decorative threads. And here we blended the red thread with the variegated thread. So it's not as stripy as what it had been on the front of the bag. Oh, and that's a little closer so you can see how that actually looks. And you can use the threads. If you're not using all the spool pins, you can place the different threads, the other threads that you're using on the empty spool pins, or you can also use a decorative spool pin that can snap on to the side. Now here we've created our own fabric, stitching on a water-soluble fabric first, or water-soluble mesh embroidery stabilizer that you are familiar with making laces and things. We used that mesh and we actually stitched rows of cover stitching, joining those all together. Then, while it was still on the stabilizer, we used it in our embroidery machine and created the flower using a freestanding flower embroidery design. So again, you can combine the different machines together and you can, again, create very different looking texture to a project. So this is also creating our own fabric where I took a mesh, like a stretch mesh fabric, and did rows of chain stitching the width of the presser foot apart. So it took about 9 hours to make the fabric, and it took an hour and a half to make the top once I had the fabric all done. But here again, you can stitch on, and this did not require any kind of stabilizer. So we just simply stitched because of the way that the feed dogs are easing the fabric in. It's going to allow you to stitch on a very wide range of fabric types. Wide cover stitch using a bright colored thread in the chain looper makes it look like shadow work. So that's the look on a sheer, not sheer, but a batiste, very lightweight fabric. So if you're wanting to create something that looks more heirloom looking, this is an organza that we actually did the stitching from the top side, and you can see that red thread shadowing through, and then stitch the green so that the chain stitch was on the top side. Now this little smocking was also done using a wide cover stitch and differential feed. So we stitched rows of differential feed stitching on a batiste fabric. With the differential feed, it gathered up the fabric and it gives you nice little pleats. So when you buy a sewing machine, you typically ask, well, how many stitches does this machine have? And, oh, it has like 700, 800 or more stitches. And we're like, that's great. And we get it home and we use 3 stitches, right? Most of the time. So here's a great way to use those other decorative stitches too, and apply them where it, of course, to a very traditional hand smocker, they would just fall out of their chair because it's like, how dare anybody do that? But, you know, we know that kids are going to wear it. They're going to use it. And do we want them, if it's something that's going to last forever and sit in a treasure box? Great. I would do it by hand too. But if they're going to wear it, they're going to get all dirty in it. This is a fast, fun, easy way to do something that looks more traditional. So now the slip on this also, I had a piece of trim, which was just that bottom embroidered trim, but I didn't want it to look like I didn't have a whole piece of fabric. So instead of just doing 1 line of stitching, I added 3 or did 3 lines of stitching so that it looked like it was part of that whole ensemble to begin with, rather than taking a solid piece of fabric and adding a trim to it. So again, you can make your fabric and your project. I always say with decorative stitching of any kind that the stitching should add to your project. You don't want it to look like your machine has just thrown up stitches all over on the project that you're working with, or try and put too many stitches all on one project, because that doesn't really add to the look of the project either. So adding them in places that are eye-catching and appealing and add value to the look of your project. So this is also a narrow cover stitch, and that narrow cover stitch using a product called Texture Magic on the bottom. So when you stitch the bodice and the bonnet, I stitched flat pieces of fabric first, steamed it, texturized the fabric, and then cut out the bodice and the bonnet. So now you have texture on your fabric. Again, using products and putting products together that are not typically used in combination with each other. But that same stitch was used at the bottom on a very sheer fabric, and it did not add texture and it didn't pucker the fabric either. This is just, again, using the cover stitch and cutting open different places on a sweatshirt so that it gives more of an open work look or window look. And here you'll see the blending of the threads that we talked about earlier. Here, Gail used several different colors of embroidery thread all in one looper, and it gives that color change, very subtle color change in the project. Wide cover stitch for doing just random applique pieces. We probably have a bunch of small 2.5-inch squares. We've just stitched those in place. And again, adding texture. I just love the way that cover stitching and chain stitching can add texture. And you can sew on fabrics that are not typical. So if you have tote bags that you've gone to several different places and you have a whole bunch of them and you want to recycle them, you can also serge through those. And here we use the chain stitching to actually quilt the fabric first and then made the project. Just as we did with this bag on the front, using that chain stitch to not only gather using the puffing, but also on that front red part of the bag, we did the chain stitching, but had the needle side showing on the top. 2-thread flatlock was used on the back side. And again, we saw that at the beginning, using the flatlock as decorative and then weaving the ribbons through. Having the narrow cover stitch and doing raw edge applique can again speed up your time and work. Sewing on a wide variety, as I said, of different fabrics. This is stitching on vinyl. So you can stitch on vinyl with your serger and not have it stick or get caught as you're stitching, because again, your feed dogs are twice as long. Now, if you're taking the handle on this bag, and we're just about finished here, the handle on the bag, instead of always having to turn a handle, I simply took the fabric, the strip of soft and stable, put heat and bond light on both sides of that strip, and then simply pressed my fabric all around so the raw edge was in the middle on the top. So when you're stitched, after you're finished, you can take your cover stitch and you can stitch right on top and cover the raw edge, and it's going to give you a decorative look at the same time as you have with adding the chain stitch. Okay, and again, flat locking, chain stitch combination. And we can't forget to mention that there's also a great cabinet that you can put these machines in too and hold it in place. Now, one thing that you don't want to do, the machines are heavier machines, about the same weight as probably a 480 machine, but they're about 30 pounds. And they have very good suction on the bottom. It's not that you can't pick them up, but what happens is that the suction cups stick to the table. And you want to have a firm area that you're going to be stitching on so that your table isn't going to bounce. The machine isn't going to bounce. It's the table that's going to be bouncing. So always place it in or on, an area that's going to support your machines. And that's any of your sewing machines as well. Now, one more quick thing before we go to the simulator, using a 4-thread overlock stitch, I like to use that for putting my binding on my quilt.
Okay.
So when I take my binding, and it doesn't matter if you're wrapping back to front or front to back, okay? It doesn't matter. Okay. You're going to always stitch with your binding on top, and you're going to place fusible thread in your lower looper.
Okay.
Okay. Now, when you stitch this and your binding's on top, you stitch your corners just like you normally do, stitch up to 1/4 inch. And then again, you take your fabric and you turn it all the way out of the way and sew off, fold your corner. And now after you have it stitched, the back thread is fusible. So now I can take this and turn it over the edge, press it in place, and now you have your binding all held in place, and you don't have to put a whole bunch of clips all the way around the outside or pins. Gotcha. And from the back side, you still have a little bit of a lip that's there for hand stitching or top stitching.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that's another fun way of being able to show it for serger, for quilting applications. Gotcha. Okay, so now with the simulator, and what I like to do is generally start with a chain stitch. And with a chain stitch, when you bring up that chain stitch, or any of the stitches, it will on the screen always show you what foot to use, what pressure to have on the foot, which is adjusted on the top of the machine, position of your cutting blade, what door you should be using, your stitch width. And then when you touch the check mark, it's already set, and it sets any adjustments to the stitch that's needed for you right on the machine. So once you have that set and you are doing your stitching, if you decide to create those ruffles like we looked at on the bag, you simply touch the area for differential feed and length, and you can adjust the differential feed and adjust the length. Now, if you're not sure what that actually means, you have those little video cameras that you can touch, and it's going to show you what that actually does or means on the machine itself, or what happens when you make an adjustment. So that's very handy when you're not sure where the book is. All of this information is built right in on the machine for you. So once you do your stitching, then it's going to remember these settings because of it has temporary altered stitch memory. So when you would go to a different stitch and then come back, it's still going to be there. And if you decide that you're going to always use that stitch for that setting, you can touch the little heart. I think I have a little lag. There we go. We have a little lag time there. And then we can save this into memory, and we can touch in gathering. All right. Now you can label up to 40 different characters there. And once you have it set, you can touch the check mark. Now it will give you, if you decide that you're wanting to use a different foot or you're wanting to have pressure set differently, you can make those adjustments, and it will also save those adjustments for you. It does not make them for you because they are mechanical changes that are made on the machine. So that's why they're in that category rather than in the screen before. So then once you have those set and you touch your check mark, now these settings are saved for that particular stitch. And each time you come to it under the favorites, it'll pull up that stitch and label it gathering. So now once you are set, and let's go back to our stitches. So you could see that we can select chain cover, triple cover, wide, narrow cover stitching, all from that category. But if I decide I'm wanting to now go from the cover stitch or chain stitching to an overlock stitch, what I can do is simply touch, and let's make sure that I have expert and guided mode. Now under the expert mode, I'm going to only be able to, it'll always take me to the stitches, right to the stitch, I should say, like I know what I'm doing. But if I don't know, or I need a little bit of help getting from one stitch to another, I can touch the guided mode. So then I'll touch overlock, and I pick whatever stitch that I want. So now it's going to take me step by step. So I don't, it's like having an instructor sitting right next to you each and every time that you're going to be moving from one stitch to another. So it has to lift your presser foot. It has you unthreading your machine. So every step along the way, what foot you would want to use, because we moved from a cover stitch to an overlock stitch, it wants us to use a different foot. And just like we showed you with the differential feed, it has the video there to show you how to make the change to the foot or other areas that you're wanting to look at. Position of your needles, the position of your cutting blade, the width of your stitch, all of these are set for you and show you the progression of moving through all the way up until the point of when you're ready to thread. And then when you're ready to thread your machine, you can thread. And this is always so important, is that you can thread it in absolutely any order. Because of the way the air threading works, it's not requiring you to thread in any order any longer. So now you can thread completely from left to right, thread your needles first. And if you're not sure how to do that, touch the video and it'll show you exactly what you need to do in order to thread that particular thread. So now with the air threading, we have what's called one-step air threading. So now instead of having to, and I'm going to pause it right here. Instead of having to turn your hand wheel to make sure your needle is in the highest position in order to get those tubes engaged properly, the needle always stops in the highest position. So you simply turn that lever over and the tubes engage themselves. Then all you need to do is step on the foot pedal and you'll hear a little hum that takes place. And that hum is the suction. You don't have to put the thread into a port. All you have to do is hover it over that threading port or nozzle, and it'll just take it and slide it right through. So that makes it super easy and very convenient as the thread comes sliding through your machine, again, threading it in absolutely any order. And once you touch the check mark, it again has automatically set all of the settings that you needed from where you were, the chain stitch, over to the 4-thread overlock stitch. Now also, I always tell everyone that you have 3 different ways to pick your stitches. 1 was the expert mode, 2 is the guided mode, and 3 is going to be the creative consultant. Because sometimes we know what fabric we're using, we know what the end result we want, but we don't know exactly what stitch or what settings it should be. So here you have 12 different fabric types to choose from. And when you are looking for your fabric type, you just simply click on the check mark. Now, because I'm working with a simulator, each time I just lay my cursor over the icon, it's going to tell me what's inside of that. On your machine, you just simply touch the question mark and lay the cursor on top, and it'll give you that information. So let's say we're going to be doing a gathering stitch. So we don't know exactly what settings we want to use. So we picked our fabric type. We see the gathering. We touch that. And now again, it's going to tell us the foot, the stitch to use, thread, and type of needle. And when we touch the check mark, because we're in guided mode, it would walk us through that setting. But I can touch expert and touch the check mark. And can you see how the settings have already changed for gathering on the weight of fabric that we had already selected? So now we don't have to guess. We don't have to wonder, did I get it set the right way? We don't have to test 45 different pieces of fabric in order to have it stitched the way we wanted at the first line of stitching. So now that you have the stitches set and ready to sew, you're already threaded, you don't have to wonder, did I do it the right way? It's already going to be set. Your stitches are going to look great, and you have the stitch that you want with the presser foot that it is telling you that you should work with as well. So it's easier to actually see this here on the simulator than it is to go over to the machine because of the distance that the camera is at. And you can also see about changing your speed. And you can also set the speed for each individual stitch. So if I saved my stitch in the memory and I was using this for, see, touched memory. Here's my gathering. I touch that. When I make that selection, if I would have changed my speed, then this would also show that my speed is changed. So it remembers the speed that you change it to, especially if you're working with decorative threads or heavier threads. It automatically slows down the speed for you in the machine. We all like to go fast, don't we?
Yes.
Okay, so let me close that. And I'm going to share, you were asking about the, okay, can you see the texture on that gray fabric?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So the gray stitching is the chain stitch, and the green stitching is the narrow cover stitch.
Okay.
By using heavy thread in the chain looper and stitching with the right side of our fabric down on the bed, kind of like doing bobbin work. So think about it just like you're doing bobbin work. When you stitch, when you flip your fabric over, you're going to see all these pretty stitches on the right side of your fabric. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Pam.
Sure. Okay, so here we are, and we have it set for the chain stitch. And earlier I mentioned that your foot pivots out of the way. So that makes it so handy and convenient because not only, I've got some other stuff here, not only do you have this extension table, but you can also slide the extension table off and you have a free arm that you're able to work with. And that when you're working with a free arm and you're doing the cover stitching that you would have on the, like you're sewing around the bottom of a cuff or a hem, you want to be able to use that free arm and access that area. So that pivoting foot makes it very easy and convenient. So I'm set for that chain stitch, and I want to simply I'm going to select the chain stitch on the screen. And I'm also going to increase my differential feed and my stitch length, like we looked at on the machine, on the simulator earlier. So now I'm just taking that strip of fabric and just like I did or had on that tote bag, I'm just going to stitch right in the middle of that fabric. And can you see how it gathers up that fabric? So now I have that gather, that ruffle that I stitched just simply by adjusting the differential feed. So now if I wanted to sew this on, I just simply touch on the screen, and I know you can't see that there's yellow boxes there, but I simply touch those yellow boxes. That brings me back to the standard stitching. So now when I sew this onto my base fabric, and now remember I'm sewing sideways here, so it's probably not going to be right on top of that other line of stitching, but you can use the markings that are on the toe of your presser foot, and you can stitch over that line of stitching. And now you would have your ruffle attached to your bag or garment or whatever it might be, okay? Now the chain stitch is what you see on the back side, okay? Now on the back side, that's where, bless you, that's where you would take the right side of your fabric, you'd put your decorative thread in your chain looper, and you would stitch with the right side of your fabric facing down. So one more thing I wanted to share with you before we move on to the overlock real quick. And that would be, I'm just simply going to add, because going from a chain stitch to a cover stitch sometimes would be difficult because you're having to unthread the machine. You're having to follow a path that is unfamiliar for what you're doing. But you do have the same path that you're going to be following for both your overlock stitching and your chain cover stitching. And the needle pad that holds the needles right here in the front is so handy so that when I add a needle in position, I'm not having to try and remember where I put it. Did it fall on the floor? It's always right there, handy for me. And my tools are right down here too. So by having the tools right there in front of you, you know where they are, and you can, oh, like me, I didn't put my lint brush away, so I have to go and find my lint brush, but that's where it would go. So all your tools are going to be right there. So once I have my path that I've followed to thread, all I need to do is thread the needle, select my narrow cover stitch. Let me move this. So go to the stitch, cover stitch. I'm going to select my narrow cover stitch. There we go. And touch the check mark. And now the stitch is all set up because I had it in expert mode and I had just added that one thread. Where if I was not sure how to do it, I could certainly be in the guided mode. Let me just thread my needle here side saddle. I could use the guided mode and follow through those steps if, again, I wasn't sure how to do it. Now, here I have a hem that I turned up, and this is on a knit fabric. So what I like to do, if I'm going to be hemming something, and I've pressed my hem in place already, so I've turned the hem up, and I'm going to move the camera back down here to the bed of the machine. There you can see that you have markings that are on the bed of the machine. So what I like to do is find the mark that is closest to where my hem is with my hem side facing up, okay? Then I'll take my hem and flip it back over. And now when I stitch, I again know what line I'm going to be following. Otherwise, I'm not sure exactly where to place my piece of fabric. So now as I stitch, again, this could be in the round or it could be on a flat piece of fabric. Okay. So now once I have this stitched, it's stitched and finished that hem edge. So now I have, let me see where I am here. So I have 2 rows of straight stitching on the front side, and I have the cover stitching. Can you see how it's covering the hem?
Isn't that kind of cool?
They're on the back side. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now that's a cover stitch. And again, you can do that wide or narrow. A chain stitch is just the same setting, only using 1 needle. Cover stitch is using 2 or more needles. Okay.
Okay. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sure. Thanks.
This is amazing. This is the best.
Yeah. So you can, as you can see, the machine itself from the beginning, where we started showing you all the different ways of using the machine. I like to start with that because everyone's like, oh, it just finishes seams. Yeah. So by showing you all the different ways that you can actually do it, you use the machine, and you can also see how easy it is to actually follow along. to set each one of those stitches. It makes it really exciting, fun to use, and again, another way of being creative.
Yes, very much
yeah.
so. Thank you.
Yeah. So anytime you want to, we can do this again, and we can show you some other cool and fun things that we come up with of using the machines.
We would love that. We would love that. In fact, we have exciting news for everybody. We are going to be hosting November 17th and 18th. You can pick the 17th or 18th. We're going to be hosting a live event with Emily. Emily's going to be our presenter.
Excellent.
Serger. So we're gonna have some fun coming up in November. So, but
perfect.
Yeah.
Well, make sure you sign up for that, because you'll have a lot of fun getting your hands on the machines themselves. Yes. And I'm not sure if you'll just have 890s or maybe some 860s that'll be in the classroom too. So you'll get a variety of different ways of using different machines.
Well, we like to have all the different machines in the classroom all the time. So we'll see what we can do.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and happy serging, and stop in at Zig-Zag Corner and see these great machines.
Thank you, Pam. We appreciate it.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.